Welcome to today's broadcast. My name is Colleen Patterson, and I'm the Director of Employer Services and Compliance at Savoy. With each passing day, we settle a little more into the current new normal. As employers continue to organize resources, certainly gather information, and plan for the next step, questions certainly arise, and federal agencies are responding with answers. Today, I wanted to call your attention to the FAQs recently released and updated by the IRS. As we know, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act, or the CARES Act, allows employers to defer the deposit and payment of the employer's share of Social Security taxes, and self-employed individuals to defer payment of certain self-employment taxes. These FAQs address specific issues related to the deferral of deposit and payment of these employment taxes. When doing some other research, I was reviewing these IRS FAQs and came across helpful information that I think employer groups may not necessarily know and can ask their tax advisor about to take advantage of the deferral. For purposes of time, I'm going to paraphrase the FAQs. So definitely make sure that you take a couple of moments if this applies to you and if there's interest to go back and take a look at them thoroughly. First, what taxes are we even talking about? The taxes that can be deferred are the deposit and payment of the employer's portion of Social Security taxes. Employers that received a Paycheck Protection Program loan may not defer the deposit and payment of the employer's share of Social Security tax that is otherwise due after the employer receives a decision from the lender that the loan was forgiven. So that's important because until that happens, the deferral of those taxes can happen. Since we're talking about PPP loans, and again, that's the Payment Protection Program loans, the question is, can an employer that has applied for and received a PPP loan that is not yet forgiven defer deposit and payment of the employer's share of Social Security tax without incurring failure to deposit and failure to pay penalties? And the IRS answered by saying, yes, employers who have received a PPP loan but would whose loan has not yet been forgiven may defer deposit and payment of the employer's share of Social Security tax that otherwise would be required to be made beginning on March 27, 2020. Through the date the lender issues a decision to forgive the loan without incurring failure to deposit and failure to pay penalties. So essentially what they're saying is that even though you applied for a PPP loan, yes, you can defer these payments until the time when your loan is forgiven, assuming that you've applied for that and it is indeed approved. So definitely want to check that out for sure. Another point to note is that once an employer receives a decision from its lender that its PPP loan is forgiven, the employer is no longer eligible to defer deposit and payment of the employer's share of Social Security tax after that date. So it's very important to take a look at that. However, the amount of the deposit and payment of the employer's share of Social Security tax that was deferred through the date that the PPP loan is forgiven continues to be deferred and will be due upon the applicable dates as outlined. So the next logical question is, well, what are the applicable dates by which deferred deposits of the employer's share of Social Security tax must be deposited to be treated as timely and avoid any failure to pay penalties? So what the IRS answered in saying was the deferred payments of the employer's share of the Social Security tax must be deposited by the following dates. And this is what they're referring to as the applicable dates in order to avoid any of the failure to deposit or pay penalties. So the date actually is that is deferred until December 31st, 2021, when 50% of the deferred amount, and on December 31st, 2022, when the remaining amount of the deferral is due. As we know, the current tax rate for Social Security paid by the employer is 6.2% of the employee's earnings up to the maximum wage base. Therefore, deferring this amount could be a solution that an employer can do today. It kind of acts like a short-term loan with no interest, and the first installment isn't due until December 31st, 2021. And yes, it is 2021, not 2020. So definitely make sure that you take a look at that and talk to your tax advisors about whether or not it makes sense to take advantage of that deferral of the Social Security tax that the employer otherwise would have to deposit. So let's shift a little bit to the DOL. So that's the Department of Labor and their FAQs. It seems with each update to their FAQs, there is more guidance on whether or not shelter at home orders meet the definition of qualifying reasons for leave under the Paid Sick Leave Act. Each time, it seems honestly more confusing. However, in the most recent release, the guidance actually is a bit more clear. So the regulations state a bright line rule that paid sick leave can be used only if the employee would have been able to perform work at the worksite or by teleworking, but for the quarantine or isolation order. So it's definitely more clear than it ever has been before. It also states that if the employer does not have work for the employee to do, regardless of the shelter in place or stay at home order, the employee is not eligible for paid sick leave. So there definitely is that defining line where before it was absolutely confusing to try to figure it out. So if you're still unsure, the Department of Labor FAQs are much more clear than they had been in the previous two versions. So definitely be sure to check that out. As always, should you have any questions, please reach out to your dedicated Savoy team and continue to use the resources available in the COVID-19 section of our website at savoyassociates.com. And there is the link to the DOL FAQs. And we also have included in today's daily brief a link to the IRS FAQs that I was mentioning as it relates to the deferral of deposit and payment for those employment taxes, specifically Social Security taxes. So definitely be sure to check that out. From all of us at Savoy, stay healthy and safe. Thank you for joining us today.